Okay, so good afternoon. Welcome to this quarter's mentorship gathering hosted by the Midwest Human Rights Consortium. We call it also MHRC. My name is Maria Ferreira. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and part of the faculty at DePaul Social Work. I'm also co-chair of the Coalition for Immigrant Mental Health, as well as part of the steering committee of the Midwest Human Rights Consortium. Welcome. Please, if you haven't already, introduce yourself in the chat. Before we get started, just a word or two about the Midwest Human Rights Consortium for those of you who are unfamiliar. MHRC is a network of multi-institutional and interdisciplinary professionals who perform both medical and psychological forensic asylum evaluations. MHRC serves as a hub for referrals. We help to connect individuals who are in need of evaluators to the evaluators themselves. MHRC is a place for training and building the workforce of practitioners who can conduct these type of evaluations. And MHRC has served as a source of support, a community network of support for and mentorship for practitioners. It is housed under the Illinois chapter of Academy of Pediatrics. It has been established by with a leadership of two remarkable and dedicated individuals, Dr. Mino Geary and Mary Elsner from ICAP, who's also with us today. We put the website link on the chat for those of you who need to refer individuals who need asylum evaluations. And then many of you who've registered who are doing these evaluations or are interested in training. We're going to try to get you onto our listserv so we can stay connected. So it's an honor to welcome today's speaker and presenter. Her work and her dedication has continued to be an inspiration to me. Dr. Aimee Hilado is an academic, researcher, clinician specializing in refugee and immigrant populations. She is the founding clinical director of the RefugeeOne wellness program that provides mental health services to humanitarian immigrants, including refugees, asylum seekers, parolees, and pre-documented participants. In January, she will be joining the faculty at the University of Chicago Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy and Practice, where she will continue to teach and conduct research on the impact of immigration trauma, early childhood adult mental health, and culturally sensitive clinical practice. She is the co-chair of the Forced Migration Work Group of the Coalition for Immigrant Mental Health. And at MHRC, she supports training efforts as part of the steering committee. Welcome, Aimee. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen for today. Go ahead and get this up. It's great to have all you participants here. We know that the need for a workforce that can conduct forensic psychological evaluations is very much needed in our communities. And so the more people we can get trained and support in this effort, the better. That said, so move to the next slide. Know that these are my affiliations that deeply inform the work that I do, the areas that I research, the opportunities I have to teach in the classroom to train the next generation of the workforce of social workers, but also recognizing that the content that I'm presenting today is really from a lot of the leaders in the field who have also trained me over the years. Some of you have had the same trainers, attorneys at NIJC, Connie Sheehan, working with different legal teams and really learning how to do this well in service of asylum applicants. And so I want to honor that. I also want to highlight that there are so many different disciplines that actually conduct these forensic evaluations. As Maria had mentioned, I am a licensed clinical social worker. And so social work as my discipline, you may see elements of that throughout the training, how I engage participants, how we think about trauma-informed, strength-based interviewing, and really how to ensure that asylum applicants beyond the forensic interview, that they are safe, they are supported, and they can be part of this process moving forward. So that said, this is where we will go in today's training. Go ahead and adjust my screen so I can see you all. To get started, we'll begin to set the stage with a discussion of who is applying for asylum and how do we support applicants who are seeking immigration relief in the United States. We'll then move to the forensic interview, thinking about how do we prepare trauma-experienced applicants for the evaluation, what are the interview components, and what are some engagement strategies you can use during your interview. Then we'll dive right into how to prepare for the affidavit. How do you structure and organize your findings? How do we write up our diagnostic sections? And then I will touch on the importance of self-care in this work. I'll then leave time for questions and answers. This is the formal portion of the training that we will be recording. Then we will pause and then we will continue in an unrecorded conversation about a specific case that I had worked on that was affirmed, that really brings to life what this process can look like. Here at MHRC, we recognize that a one-time training is not going to necessarily give us all the skills to be able to conduct this independently. But I hope that this training is a start. It gives you a taste for what the process can look like, some of the considerations you want to take as you are doing these evaluations, and then hopefully the energy, the passion, the excitement to get more training and to continue this process moving forward. So let's start here. These are the images of people that are languishing in refugee camps, folks that are waiting at closed borders, hoping to apply for asylum, communities that are crossing dangerous bodies of water. They are walking long distances in the hope of being able to rebuild their lives with safety and dignity. We know that every immigrant story is different though. And here in the United States, immigration status upon entry really does matter. It provides a framework for what benefits, what rights and privileges are going to be afforded to them. And so as we think about a broad category of humanitarian immigrants, those that are forcibly displaced, those that have no choice but to leave their country if they want to survive and thrive, we're going to focus on a specific group of people, people that are going to apply for asylum as their form of immigration relief in the United States. And there's two categories of asylum seekers. Affirmative asylum seekers are those that are coming to our southern border. They're declaring that they cannot go back to their country and they would like to be granted entry to start the process. Defensive asylum seekers are those that are already in the interior. So they're here in the United States. Maybe they came with a visa, maybe they came without documentation and were not detected. And now that they're in the interior, now that they're in the United States, they want to file for safety because they do have a well-founded fear of persecution and they don't want to return home. As we do this work, to understand the context of forcibly displaced populations, why they're coming to the United States, we really want to think about their migration journey. We break that up into three different elements. Pre-migration experiences, those experiences in their home country that led them to leave their countries in the first place. We think about the experiences in transit, whether that's 1 week of travel or maybe a decade of travel to get to the United States. And then we want to think about those post-migration experiences. What are those experiences once they enter the United States, maybe once they are detained at the border? How does that exacerbate kind of the experiences they've had across their entire migration journey? Because if we look at the scope of that journey, that's going to speak to any emergent or current mental health problems that will manifest during your evaluation. Remember that the forensic evaluation process, it seeks to document migration experiences that are traumatic and impair psychological functioning. There is an emphasis on those pre-migration experiences, but if we see patterns of trauma throughout their story, it's something that we want to document. And oftentimes when you are working with forcibly displaced immigrants, trauma is threaded in that migration story. So it's helpful to unpack what makes an experience traumatic. It's one in which you experience a threat to your physical and emotional well-being. That experience may be one experience, it may be multiple experiences over the course of a period of time. They're perceived as overwhelming. You feel intense feelings of fear, a lack of control over your situation. And because it's so overwhelming, because you're afraid, because you feel you have no control, it oftentimes leaves you feeling helpless. It changes how you view yourself. It can change how you view others. It can change how you view opportunities, the world around you. And if we zoom out and we think about common denominators of immigration trauma, for humanitarian immigrants, all of these apply. That they speak about this history of fear and uncertainty, not knowing where they will go next. There's a yearning for safety and comfort with food, shelter, basic needs being met, and worry about where they will land, especially for asylum seekers that don't have status in the US. Make no mistake that even though they are applying for asylum, they have opportunities to think about what it would be like to rebuild their lives in another country. They still miss the country, the people they left behind, which will exacerbate feelings of loneliness, homesickness, and isolation. And because we're so connected with global technology, with Facebook, WhatsApp, we're hearing news in real time, survivor guilt is real. A lot of the folks that we interview in this process, they are thinking about the people they left behind, the country they left behind, and why they're so lucky to not be in that specific circumstance, even though their situation is still pending, right? It's still not affirmed. And all of this has a cumulative impact on their mental health. When we think about the forensic evaluation process, not only are we trying to document traumatic effects, but we want to think about the physical, the emotional, the cognitive reactions that really reflect that trauma that they experienced. So anything that you can get, anything that you can obtain during the interview that speaks to that feeling of intense fear, feeling overwhelmed, that worry about the future, that too should be included in your report because it speaks to that well-founded fear of persecution. And so as you get started with the forensic interview process, there are a couple steps that can get you launched in this area. First, you're going to be working with your legal team, and it's appropriate for you to ask for the I-589 form. This is the application for asylum and withdrawal from removal form. It's going to give you a lot of information on the applicant, birth dates, any relatives, any family members that are part of the application. It's going to give you information where they first filed for asylum, whether it was kind of at a detention site, at the border, or whether it was through a legal clinic. It's also going to provide information about where they lived, if they've moved multiple times, as well as clear statements of why they are leaving, why they left their country of origin, and why they are filing for immigration relief now. You can also request any draft declarations that may have been completed. In some cases, the attorneys, the legal team has already met with the applicant and has already done an oral history of the reasons why that person left and why they are applying now. In some cases, they have nothing. They may not have met or had an in-depth interview with the applicant. And so your forensic interview may be the first baseline of information that is collected. In either case, those two will help inform what are the potential needs that are going to be presented, what are the potential areas of psychological needs that may need to be assessed, and then it can help you prepare yourself for the interview. You'll also want to ask the legal team, what's the legal question that needs to be answered? Again, the goal of the process is to be able to establish that there was a well-founded fear of persecution, and that was the reason why the person had left their country and came to the United States to file for immigration relief. That legal question can be very specific, it can be very broad, but it oftentimes falls in the area of what was the trauma experience? What was the nature of the context that you were in that would suggest that there was this well-founded fear that should you have stayed in that context, your rate of survival is probably minimal, right? The risk of harm is huge. The risk of survival is questionable, and that you really had no choice. They will ask for details. Was the gang violence severe enough? Was the torture because of your religious belief? Was it difficult, severe enough to warrant you leaving? These are the type of questions that the legal team will give you guidance on that can help inform how you will structure your interview. Once you have this initial information, then you could start coordinating the logistics of your interview. Where will the interview take place? Will it take place at a legal clinic? In a time of a pandemic, we've been doing a lot of these interviews via Zoom. Will you need interpretation? Is that something that the legal team will coordinate for you, or will you need to find a skilled interpreter that can assist? Will you be using standardized assessments? Again, based on what information the legal team can give you with the 589 form and any draft declarations, it can give you a sense of the scope of things that you want to look for in your interview. And then finally, has it been approved that any participants or observers could be at the interview? These interviews, you should block them out in times of 2 to 3 hour increments. It's quite difficult to navigate an interview much longer than that, even if you include breaks. And recognize that if you can't get all the details that you need, if you can't answer that legal question in one session, you may have to schedule multiple sessions, and you want to be sure to be transparent with that from the very beginning. If possible, ask for permission to audio record or even Zoom record these interviews. That will give you an opportunity to be more present. You're not feverishly scribbling notes of what the respondent is saying, but you can be present for the interview and then refer back to those recordings when it's time to write. You'll need to have an agreed upon just understanding of how long you will keep those records. Will they be destroyed after your affidavit is signed, notarized, and completed? Will you keep them until the case is affirmed? I think those are agreements you need to have with the applicant as well as the legal team. And then finally, you want to prepare yourself. I think that we have to be professionally responsible to know what cases will activate us. And I think as human beings, the stories we hear will be tough, but it's our responsibility to be able to identify if a specific scenario that's presented in the I-589 in the application, if it's going to be something that we are able to manage with supportive reflective supervision, if we feel equipped to be able to navigate that interview. And if you do feel that the case may not be within the scope of what you can manage because of the content, because of something about the case, it's important to let the legal team know in advance so that case can be assigned to someone who can do the best job for our legal team as well as the applicant. As we move forward, recognize that there's a clear distinction between what a forensic interview looks like and a clinical interview. It really isn't about a therapeutic process. It really is a finite period of time where there are clear objectives that need to be met. And so it can feel different from a clinical interview. And I want to take a moment to highlight some of these distinctions. So first, relational privilege. Everything that's shared in a forensic evaluation is really not confidential. It goes into the report, it's shared with the legal team. As a forensic interviewer, you are taking an investigative evaluative stance, recognizing that people can lie. And so you go into these interviews trying to find consistencies with the I-589 form, the declaration documents. You're looking at the sequence of their story, asking questions to ensure that you are very clear that the story that's being reported is reflective of some accurate statements that are seen elsewhere, corroborating information. But again, you're looking for internal consistency. In terms of the area of competence in a forensic interview, again, you're not relying on the therapeutic process. It really is about the evaluation and being able to look at the claims that are being made that you know will be scrutinized under immigration law. And so it goes back to the nature of the hypothesis. This isn't about helping people navigate kind of the trauma they've experienced. It's about answering a legal question and demonstrating that there are psychological presentations that answer that question. Because that is the nature of the interview, it can feel adversarial at times. You may find yourself repeatedly asking the same question over and over until you understand the impact, until you are able to see a general flow of sequence that can be or cannot be explained by trauma symptoms or the like. You want to make sure that your questions are being answered. And because of that, your judgment as an evaluator will look different. It is less about connection, though you do need rapport in order to get through the interview. It's about trying to stay as detached and unbiased as possible so that you can go back to that investigative, evaluative stance. It's going to be parallel to what they'll experience with the attorneys. Now, despite having those objectives, the interview process can be experienced as therapeutic, that you can go into these interviews, these evaluations with kindness, compassion, and empathy. And I think it goes a long way in helping to get the true story of what people have experienced. If you're working with folks with trauma, this is so critical. So even though we are trying to investigate and corroborate information, there's a way to validate and normalize people's reactions, to be able to acknowledge the difficulty of telling a person's story and to allow space for them to regulate. that, again, everything doesn't have to happen in 2 to 3 hours. It's about pacing it so that you can get the most accurate report of what that person experienced, and you can document their symptoms in the most accurate way. I invite you to validate strengths when you see them, to be able to say, that was really brave of you that you asked for help. It took a lot of courage to be able to step up when you saw that injustice happening to you. And to provide encouragement throughout your interview, to say, you're doing great. You are halfway through. We are getting through these questions. Do you need to take a break? We can do that, but you're doing wonderfully in this process. And we know it's a hard process. You want to be able to use your clinical judgment as well. As people are telling their stories and they are reporting their symptoms, it's important to provide resources at the end if you believe it's warranted. So again, to reiterate, our goal in a forensic interview: document psychological impairments due to past trauma, and ensure that the client feels safe and supported to continue after the interview. The asylum process is so long. People are waiting years for a resolution. It's important that we recognize that this is one step in a lot of interviews. And when they get to their hearing, the type of scrutiny that they're going to experience is going to continue beyond your evaluation. So you want to ensure to use every moment you have to instill confidence in their ability to navigate, to move forward with the process, but also wanting to maintain that there are certain objectives and priorities you need to attend to as you move forward. And so let's get to the interview. These are the components. I broke them up into these categories: pre-trauma experiences, specific descriptions of the torture and abuse that they experience, whether it's singular or multiple experiences; post-trauma experiences that can include their migration journey; a diagnostic section where we look at the mental status exam, as well as any other standardized assessments; and then closing out your interview. Remember that we want to engage our clients, our applicants in this process. And so there are some strategies to get just as much information that will help with the report writing and help the legal team, again, answer that question: is there a well-founded fear of persecution that warranted this person leaving their home country and coming for immigration relief? It's always helpful to begin with the non-threatening questions as you start to build rapport and build confidence in the process. So sometimes questions like, what was it like? Tell me what it was like growing up in your neighborhood before all of the problems started, before that traumatic experience. There are a number of techniques that you can use to elicit applicant feedback. And it's always helpful to get as much of the applicant's firsthand reports, firsthand accounts versus yes or no responses. It really goes a long way for the legal team, as well as your own report. So summary approaches, such as saying, could you describe what it was like growing up? Narrative approaches, what was it like to be in that situation where you were threatened by gangs? And when it comes to trauma-related content, to be open-ended in that. Tell me what happened when you were detained. It's important for you to observe and ask about reactions as they are sharing their trauma story. So to take a moment and say, that was a really tough part of your story. I'm wondering what's coming up for you. Are you feeling any sensations in your body? I noticed that you're touching your chest. I noticed that your breath was quickening. Do you feel this often? Do you feel this whenever you tell a story about what happened to you? All of this is information that you want to document and then include in your report. As I mentioned, the adversarial nature of the forensic interview, you will have to repeatedly ask questions at times to get clarity. And so sometimes it's useful to explain why you're asking the question. I'm asking this question because I want to make sure I understand your experiences clearly so that I can document it. Sometimes I will get confused looks when I ask about symptoms that don't apply. So I oftentimes, when I ask, do you hear voices that other people can't hear? Do you see things that other people can't see as I'm screening for psychosis? If I get a pause and it seems to create some tension in the air, I oftentimes will explain, these are symptoms that some people feel. It may not apply to you, but for those that it does, when you tell me, I'm able to get resources to you. If it doesn't apply, you can just tell me no. You also want to take an opportunity at the beginning of the interview to make agreements about taking breaks. It's best to be transparent. So this is going to be, we have 2 hours together and we're going to take a break, multiple breaks, as we go through this interview process. You can signal me if it feels too intense. If I feel like we've covered some tough content, I'm going to request that we take a break. Let's take a breath together. Let's take a sip of water together. And to have those agreements in place to make sure that we can get our candidates, these applicants, through the process. So let's dive to the interview components. Pre-trauma experiences. We begin with getting a baseline of what their functioning looks like from very early in life. So taking a social history, who's in your family, what was it like growing up in your neighborhood? Did you have your basic needs met? Any cultural considerations you want to think about, things that stand out for that person before the trauma or traumatic experiences happened. This will include any relevant medical or psychosocial histories. Were they hospitalized? Do they remember being sick? Do they remember anyone in their family being sick? All of this you want to document before we dive into the trauma history. On the next slide, you're going to see snapshots, examples of affidavits that I have written, blinded with information removed, to give you a sense of also what the report can look like. When you present this information, we'll take a deeper dive later on in the training, but to give you a sense, you'll always be able to provide at the outset of your report, what's the basic information, what is the basic reason why this person is applying for asylum, and then it goes right into that baseline functioning. It goes right into that social history, any past medical or psychosocial elements that you want to include. If there's nothing to include, you write that there is no remarkable history to note, but you want to make sure these sections are identified. Then we're going to go into the specific trauma, document the trauma, the torture, the abuse, ask the who, what, when, where, and how questions. If there was trauma that was experienced in transit to the United States that reflect maybe activated responses to past trauma, you'll want to document that as well. Then we'll go into the post-trauma experiences. What was the ultimate tipping point when that person decided this is not sustainable, I have to leave the country, and what were the means for travel? This is where you will also include ports of entry, where they filed for asylum, where they are located now. And again, some of that information will be available in the I-589 form. You're just going to make sure to confirm that information during your interview. This is also where documentation of symptoms is going to land. And I give you a sample in the graphic pic on this slide of how that information will show up in the report. Again, you'll have the general history, you'll go into the specific details, the timeline of the abuse, as well as the migration journey up to the point when they applied for asylum. Then there will be a section that is just on diagnostics. So the mental status exam and any standardized psychological instruments that you use, if you choose to use them. Again, every discipline is trained different. Some folks are able to conduct these interviews just using the clinical interview and observation. Others will integrate standardized assessments, and we'll speak more to that. I'll speak more to that in the next slide. But for the mental status exam, we just want to capture general observations about their appearance, their behavior throughout the interview, and we want to get a sense of their thinking, emotion, and cognitive processes. So when it comes to thinking, we want to think about how they process the interview questions, how much information they give. So are they answering questions directly, or is it always tangential? Do you find yourself having to repeat yourself in order for them to answer the question? Or is it yes, no responses rather than being able to give rich details of the experience? When it comes to the emotion, did you observe any emotion in the interview? And what was the general climate of the interview? How was that applicant feeling as they were speaking and demonstrating they were feeling during the interview process? And then when it comes to cognition, we want to think about, are they oriented to time, place? Simple questions. Reflecting on their birth date. Do they know what year it is? Do they know what city it is? I know our psychiatrist on our team will ask memory questions. What did you eat for breakfast? Do you remember what you ate last night? Sometimes showing 3 objects at the beginning of the interview and then asking them to recall at the end to get a sense of their thinking process. In addition to the more diagnostic, is there a mental health problems we need to document? Now, if you are using an interpreter, after your interview, you're going to want to have a conversation with the interpreter to get a sense of, are you changing words in the native language for them to understand the content? Are they speaking at a pace, at a tone that is typical of native speakers? That too needs to be documented. Now, oftentimes there are questions about how to use standardized assessments, when to use them, which instruments should I use more than one, how do I report them? And again, in terms of the discipline that you're trained in, I think that will provide guidance on how you will use standardized instruments. And it is also your comfort level and the applicant that is in front of you. If you have applicants that are difficult to engage, are not good at self-reporting, sometimes it helps to start with a standardized assessment, because yes, no questions are much easier to answer than asking them to narrate their experiences. That's a consideration. The age of the applicant. I think that the younger the child, standardized tools are very helpful, and also asking for multiple people to complete an assessment on the child so you get a holistic sense of how that child is presenting in different settings, school, in the home. So parent reports are common, teacher reports are common whenever we're evaluating young children. I personally tend to use standardized assessments at the end of my interview. After doing the clinical interview, I usually use tools to help confirm what it is, the symptoms that were reported throughout the evaluation. In terms of which instruments you can use, when you review the initial paperwork from the legal team, it will give you a sense of the different domains you might want to consider. And then as you do your interview, that will help you get a sense of which ones do you really need to focus on. Sometimes PTSD symptoms are so apparent, and so you may not necessarily need to use a tool to assess for PTSD. But if you're wondering, okay, there's a little bit of generalized anxiety that I think might be there, or some other domain that you want to explore, it might be helpful to use a tool. But the rule of thumb is always use a tool that you're trained to use. Will it strengthen your affidavit to use 4, 5, or 6? Not necessarily. It depends on how strong the evidence is for whatever symptoms you are observing, whatever psychological presentation you are observing. It's not going to be useful to have 5 different tools that screen for trauma. You also want to think about the applicant in this process. Assessment tools can lead to a lot of fatigue in the interview. And so you want to be thoughtful about how you use your time to keep the applicant engaged, and recognize that if you're going to have multiple sessions, you might want to think about how you use your time and keep that rapport with the client, so that they will come back should you need to ask additional questions. In terms of reporting, the use of standardized assessments, recognize that everyone from the immigration judge to the legal teams that are reviewing these documents, they are not clinicians. And so you want to be as direct and clear as possible. A lot of the jargon around validity and efficacy may not be as helpful to the legal team. So when reporting, what's the tool? What does it measure? What's the general range that we are looking for someone who has a typical presentation? Where did the applicant score? And then provide explanation for that score, whether they are within range and there isn't a need, or whether they are out of range and it indicates X, Y, and Z. So again, you can use standardized assessments. They can be very helpful in the process. You just want to make sure that it is not a disservice to the applicant and that it is useful to your report. More is not always better. We use the Istanbul Protocol for documenting patterns of symptoms. So this is language that will should show up in your report, whether or not the symptoms are consistent with, not consistent with, highly consistent with, typical of, or diagnostic of. It's language that we want to recognize because this is an interview process for humanitarian relief. And then we close out the interview. At this point in the interview, after you've asked your questions, you've gotten a sense of their immigration journey, you've done your assessments if you so choose to use them, I oftentimes will close with asking questions about what they hope for the future if they were to stay in the United States. And I also ask them what they fear most if they were to be returned to their country. And this is where a trauma-informed, strength-based approach is so critical. You have now, for example, spent 2 to 3 hours with a person who has shared some of the most scary elements of their story with you. And so it's important that as you have them unpack their story, that we don't leave them feeling raw, that we try and close it up and pack things up for them in a way that they can move forward. So validating an applicant's strength in sharing their story and completing in the interview is so important. Being able to ask, you shared a lot with me, you shared a lot about the symptoms that you're experiencing, even things that I observed during the interview. What are some of your coping skills that you lean on when you're feeling worried, when you're feeling sad, when you're feeling stressed? Who are your support systems? Who can you go to today if you're not feeling well? If you feel that a mental health service referral is warranted, ask the applicant whether they'd be interested. Have you spoken to anyone about these symptoms? Would you like to be referred to services? And at the very least, wish them the best of luck. We know that this process is long. We don't know when they will get a response or a resolution. And so at very best, it's important to express confidence that they can navigate this process, however long that process will be. Now, after the interview, you're going to want to go back to the legal team and share some of the findings, whether it will be multiple sessions or whether it be this singular session. You'll want to share the general presentation of the client, confirm a diagnosis if that was applicable, and then if there were any inconsistencies that you found in your interview that compares with the declarations that were provided or the I-589. You also want to ask if there are any additional legal questions that have come up in between the time the case was assigned to you and when your interview was conducted. Know that at this point, you'll get directions from the legal team. There will be back and forth in terms of what content should be included, how content should be reframed, if they want you to speak more to how just the psychological symptoms can be presented to be useful to the legal team and for the applicant. So let's go right into how to prepare your report. You'll see that on the left in the blue box, again, I will say that across disciplines, if you have reviewed templates from a number of different programs, you'll find that there is no one singular template that is available. This template reflects what seems to have worked for the legal teams that I have worked with. It makes sense for me in the way I conduct interviews, and it replicates a lot of the templates that I've seen in terms of just comprehensive information that is clear and direct for legal teams. And so I've got 9 different sections that show up in my report. Before we go into the details of your affidavit, use headings. I found that legal teams, they like to be able to see the different sections very clearly. So APA headings 1, 2, 3, and 4, use them. Also in sequential number order, you want to use that for all of your statements. Oftentimes legal teams, when they are referencing your affidavit, they will say in section 4, history of abuse, statement number 17, they will ask for that information, or they will cite your report in that way. So numeric sequencing throughout your report, as well as these headings, is going to help organize the content for your legal team. And you'll see more examples of that in the next slides. So when we start with case information, this is just the background information of who the applicant is. A lot of this can come from the I-589 form, as well as who you are and who was present at the interview. Your next section will be your credentials. And so this is where you outline your skills in the field, your education, the training you've received. It's really about establishing that you are an expert to be able to conduct a forensic evaluation. And then we go into the background of the client. Remember that in terms of these documents, there's a lot of paperwork. So you want to be clear from the very beginning what the experience of the client is, and then go into the history and then the diagnostic section. Before I go too far, I should say that in terms of the length of the report, you want to keep it as concise as possible. And some of the guidance I've received from legal teams is no more than 13 to 15 pages, 20 max. I know that that might be hard if it is a complicated case, but recognize that in terms of paperwork, there are hundreds and hundreds of pages of documentation that the legal team will submit in addition to your affidavit. And so to ensure that the content is actually read, you want to be as concise, clear, and keep your report as well formatted as possible so they get to the information that they need as quickly as possible. That said, here on this slide, you'll see background information of the applicant, the general information to give you a sample of what it could read, how it can read. This applicant survived severe domestic violence and gang-related violence in which she was repeatedly harassed, threatened, and severely beaten by this person, the perpetrator, over the course of X number of years. Consequently, the applicant reports suggested experiences of severe physical and psychological harm that has impaired her ability to function from the onset of the abuse to present day. So already at the beginning, I'm saying this was the source of the trauma, this was the course of time that it was experienced, and she has experienced impairments as a result. Then I go into the past medical history, the past psychosocial history, and then the next section is the abuse. You've seen this image before, the sample affidavit content. I want to be clear that don't let the numbers, the sequential numbers fool you, that you will have multiple statements within each of these headings. So it's never going to be one paragraph, 11, 12, 13, and 14. Depending on the details of that what the applicant gives you, you may have multiple statements that speak to the nature of the abuse, the summary of the abuse, the timeline of the abuse, and then their journey to the United States. We then go to the psychological history and the examination. And I always begin with a statement about how I assess the client. I'm going to just read this so you get a sense of ways that your descriptions can be presented. In my example, statement 15, I completed the clinical interview that lasted X number of hours, X number of minutes via video conference Zoom platform because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Questions examined symptoms of potential depressive, anxiety, psychotic, and trauma disorders were asked during the interview. I also observed the applicant's current mental status exam, including all of these different areas. So already at the outset, you give the reviewers a sense of what are the things that were conducted during the interview. If I used a standardized assessment, I would put that here. I also used 3 different standardized tools to assess for X, Y, and Z. This is also the section where you're going to include psychological complaints, the mental status exam, any assessments of functioning, findings from standardized assessments that you might use. And on the next slide, you'll see an example of how I write up psychological complaints. Here again, you're going to see the heading, current psychological complaints, and then each statement speaks to an umbrella of symptoms that were reported during the interview. So statement 16, the applicant endorses current and persistent symptoms. I'm going to move my screen around, of depression, including X, Y, and Z, specifically pulling from the language of the applicant. So what exactly did the applicant say she was experiencing, he was experiencing, they were experiencing, and then writing that word for word as best as I can into the affidavit. Statement 17, the applicant also endorsed current recurring trauma-related symptoms, including X, Y, Z. She also reported feeling emotionally, physically upset when reminded by traumatic events of the past as seen in X, Y, and Z, rapid heartbeats, sweating, so very specific, always tying it back. In that statement, I added that the sensations were reported and experienced throughout the evaluation. So she's experiencing them in real time and I saw it and I want to document that. Statement 18, additional avoidant behaviors that were reported. And then I always have a suicide assessment statement in this section. So at the time of evaluation, a suicide assessment was conducted. There was no indicators of imminent harm. To the next slide. Then we go into a section that is the interpretation of the findings. So remember, in that section, it's going to be pretty meaty. All the symptoms, mental status exam, you're going to have standardized assessment findings. The interpretation section, I tend to keep it relatively short, usually 3 to 4 statements. My first statement usually speaks to whether or not I found that the applicant's report is consistent with the experiences they reported. And so again, is it straightforward? Is it honest? My second statement tends to be whether or not their report of their trauma maps on to the psychological presentation we expect of someone who has experienced severe trauma. And then my final statement tends to speak to whether or not a diagnostic criteria was met. And so just for the sake of example, first statement, my assessment of the applicant demonstrates historical and psychological evidence consistent with the severe trauma he alleges. The information that the applicant related was internally consistent with sufficient detail. The applicant answered all questions in a straightforward manner with sufficient details, no evidence of defensive behavior or an over-endorsement of the symptoms. This is, again, in this case, it mapped on. I believe this client that everything was internally consistent, corroborated with the report, so I want to state that from the beginning. My next statement is about mental distress. And yes, it does indicate that he survived traumatic experiences. And in this case, he did meet a diagnosis. I put his symptoms were consistent, persistent, and impaired his ability to function, and were consistent with a mental illness. In some cases, you're going to be evaluating folks that have symptoms that do not necessarily meet a DSM-5 criteria. And there are still ways that you can discuss that. In this example, I map out that yes, there are, after this traumatic event, the applicant described experienced symptoms that included X, Y, and Z. They're consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, but the duration and the intensity of the symptoms did not meet the full criteria. And that's okay. Remember that when it comes to the evaluation, it's not about getting to the DSM-5 diagnosis. It's about documenting psychological distress that is tied to trauma as the grounds for having a well-founded fear of persecution. Yes, a DSM-5 diagnosis is clear, but at the same time, that's not our goal. It's about accurately reflecting the client's story and demonstrating that there was a justification for why they left and why they're coming to the United States. And then finally, in the conclusion, this is where, again, the closing remarks of the interview to talk about this is a case in which a person has experienced trauma, that their functioning was impaired, but also recognizing that there may be moments where the person is doing quite well and wants to contribute. Statement 41 is a good example of this. You may encounter clients or applicants who are feeling much better now that they're in the United States, and a lot of those symptoms that gave them trouble before, they don't exist anymore. To be able to recognize that people can heal and flourish when they're not in that environment is important to include. And then finally, that statement about what they believe could happen if they were to return, right? That in this example, this applicant stated without hesitation that she would be killed by so-and-so because of her political activism if she was returned to her country of origin. At no point do I say, give this person asylum, right? Because of the trauma that they've experienced, because the evidence of psychological distress that this person has experienced. That's not our job. The legal team is going to do that. But what we've done in our report is document a trauma, map on that there is a psychological presentation that demonstrates the trauma was experienced, and that the applicant is going, in that applicant's own words, they're reporting ongoing risk. And so if we already know that there was past trauma and there is documentation of real psychological distress and harm, then the risk that could be experienced upon returning is real, that it's not made up. It's something that could actually happen and harm them if we don't make an affirmative decision on behalf of the client. So you don't have to say that outright, but this is kind of the case that we're building in tandem with the legal team on behalf of the applicant. Your affidavits will then have a statement of truthfulness that needs to be included, that you are completing this under a penalty of perjury in the United States of America. Then you will have a final section that is your signature. You get your affidavits notarized. The legal team will ask for your CV to again document that you are an expert able to do this forensic interview, and then you submit that over to the team. In some cases, you may have to provide oral testimony in addition to the evaluation. And so that is an entirely different training on its own, but know that the legal team will prepare you for testimony and any cross-examination that might happen. Just a couple tips during oral testimony, you want to be as clear as possible and take out all the technical clinical jargon. The immigration judge, the legal teams will not respond as well if it's not as clear and direct. And recognize that you're only going to be able or expected to respond to what's within the scope of your expertise and what was reported during the interview. You can't speculate if there was a story outside of the information that you received. So know that that is an additional task that may be asked of you when doing these evaluations. It's something that, again, you will get a lot of support on from the legal team. And know that, again, there's a scope of what you are expected to be able to answer and respond to. That said, you're going to be witness to some very difficult stories. Vicarious trauma is a real risk in doing this type of work. And so we know compassion fatigue is real when we are not aware of just our own reactions to the stories that we're hearing. If we're not good at self-supervising, if we're not getting reflective support, it can compromise our ability to do this work. And so just a note to all of us professionals that will do this in the future, who are doing this, we want to pay attention to our own responses to the stories we hear. If we're experiencing fatigue, any anxiety, somatic symptoms, we can't control much after we finish our affidavit. The timelines are very long. And so thinking about what are the things we can control on behalf of the client, on behalf of even the asylum system. Stay connected with people that support you, that help keep you grounded, and be very intentional in the behaviors and activities you use to promote your own physical and mental well-being. And if you find yourself struggling in the process, not just doing this work, but any work that involves hearing the stories of those that are struggling around us, be sure to get professional help. It's the best practice in the field, and we want to make sure that we maintain the workforce of folks that can do this work. This is my contact information. So if you have any questions about evaluations, feel free to email me at my clinical site at RefugeeOne, Hilado at RefugeeOne. And at this time, that ends the formal training portion of this presentation. We are going to stop. Well, no, I won't stop the share, but we're going to stop the recording at this point, and then we'll move to offline Q&A and a case study.